Celine Driver writes, I think a video treatment of the Navitimer is in order. Designer notes subject 53. It's a designer's nightmare. Don't get me wrong, there is much to like about the Breitling Navitimer. But when Willy Breitling sought out to make the end-all and be-all of chronographs, a lot was put on the table. If we could ask him which of the complications and scales he would like to keep, this third-generation Breitling would outright tell you, what kind of a question is that? Of course, I need them all in there. Yep, a designer's nightmare. Designers have been, of course, born with challenges to overcome. The first, conceived for the wrist watch, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, came from Patek Philippe and sold to the Countess of Koskowitz of Hungary. The challenge here is to make a watch for the wrist, and not to convert a pocket watch to fit this small size. In 1880, Gerard Perregaux was tasked to make a wristwatch to be useful in trench warfare by the German Navy. It had to be robust, legible, and quick to access. It makes sense, since pulling a pocket watch might be just the last thing in your mind while being sprayed by bullets along the war trenches. It's much debated as to how this wristwatch looked like, but at least there's enough reputable sources to put a test to its existence. The challenge was indeed met. For the Navitimer, the challenge was to make an already remarkable chronomat, a chronograph capable of mathematical computations, into an aviation instrument with all the necessary skills for a pilot. Willy Breitling famously, begrudgingly accepted the challenge and assembled what many would put as one of the greatest chronographs ever created. Like, comment, and subscribe for content you'd like to see next. Follow us on Instagram at Design Atelier Aruba for behind-the-scenes content. Submit your pics and videos to designatelierviewer@gmail.com. The original chronomat was released in 1941 with the Breitling patented slide rule complication on its bezel. This clever feature is able to provide computations before the advent of, computers. Slide rules are typically a set of scales that can be slid to line up to a particular calibration. This made engineers' work a lot less tedious. Willy Breitling brought this same functionality on the wrist. This chronomat has a tachymeter, telemeter, pulsimeter, and multiplication scale. This watch can be legitimately called as the first smartwatch in some regards, one that doesn't have to be charged daily. Here's looking at you, Apple. This serves as the basis for the navigation timer or Navitimer. This new timepiece needs to employ 3 new metrics for navigation: statutory miles, nautical miles, and kilometers. These, on top of all the other chronograph markers and features, need to be present in the Navitimer. Willy Breitling needs to fit all of these scales on top of the Venus caliber 178. The chronomat typically uses the Venus 175, which has just 2 subdials. But for the Navitimer, the Venus 178 will have 3 subdials that will occupy quite a bit of dial real estate. This chronograph movement provides a 30-minute chronograph subdial at the 3 o'clock position, 12-hour chronograph at the 6 o'clock position, and a running seconds at the 9 o'clock position. These subdials are fixed to the movement, so there's little that can be done about their location. However, for the Navitimer, these subdial diameters were shrunk as much as possible compared to other watches that use the same chronograph movement. Now that the space is determined on the dial, the scales of the slide rule has to come in. 3 scales had to fit within this dial. The clever thing about this is that 2 of the scales are both measured in distance. This can be done in the same visual perimeter. The other unit of measurement is distance per hour. This would go to the inner part of the slide rule. These can now be calibrated to both the miles and kilometer units. The chronograph seconds also has to be precisely marked. While these are typically seen a bit further on the dial, for the Navitimer this had to be added within the slide rule scale. Some of the numerals are omitted, but the markers are still there. The slide rule bezel can now be added at the outer edges. This would serve as the user-calibrated scale. Having this in white creates a distinct contrast that will become the Navitimer's signature. Finally, the numerals for the conventional hour markers were added, with the 3, 6, and 9 omitted for the subdials. The Navitimer and the IOPA logo were added on the dial to set it apart from the chronomat. This was the first Navitimer. Much of the things we associate about the Navitimer today is in this first model. Visually, it's unique. Functionally, it fulfills the needs of the aviators of the time. Through the years, we can see the Navitimer evolve. Earlier in the run, Value 72 movements were used when there was a shortage of Venus 178s. These Navitimers look typically identical. Some cosmetic changes start to create a more visually interesting dial as well, such as the contrasting subdials. An attempt to make a less cluttered dial is seen by the use of baton markers instead of Arabic numerals. This indeed freed up much space to the dial, but somehow makes it less appealing because it feels incomplete. By making the dial visually detailed, it created a uniform identity. This is lost a little bit by freeing up some space with the baton markers. In 1959, the Navitimer Cosmonaut was created. Legend has it that Scott Carpenter, an American astronaut and owner of a Navitimer in the Korean War, commissioned Breitling to create a 24-hour version of the Navitimer to help him tell the time while in space. Notice too that these models sport a double plain Breitling logo instead of the IOPA. In 1967, a date complication was added to the Navitimers after using the value 7740. One could argue that the date complication is not needed for a chronograph, but can you say it's the ultimate chronograph if it didn't have a date complication? Red markers were also added all over the dial to aid in the alignments of the slide rule. These markers also added sprinkles of life and vibrancy in the sea of detail. Later models brought more than color to the Navitimer, but also precious metals such as gold on the case. Simpler versions with 2 subdials were made, with the date window occupying the 6 o'clock position and subdial. The crown is also at the 9 o'clock position with these chronomatic movements. With Hamilton Buren, Dubois Duprat, Hoyer, and Breitling working together, they developed the chronomatic chronograph movement, one of the first automatic chronographs to be mass-produced for the public. There were also quartz Navitimers that was, of course, an attempt to be relevant in the proliferation of quartz watches. However, the quartz Navitimer could not prevent Breitling from decreasing sales and eventually had to be sold. In 1978, Ernest Schneider, holder of the Sakura brand of affordable watches, bought Breitling and moved it to Grenchen and relaunched it in 1982. In the 80s, the Navitimer started using Lemania movements with some notable deviations from the previous generation. The slide rule is now noticeably concave. In a way, this created more space to print all the details rather than on the shallow convex slide rule. Another thing to notice in the 80s is that another model of the Navitimer started appearing, but with the brand name Zinn. Yes, that's Zinn by Helmut Zinn. People may call it homaging or plagiarizing the Navitimer, but this model is a legitimate piece of watchmaking history. Zinn actually managed to secure the rights to produce this Navitimer lookalike with genuine Navitimer parts and features under the 903 ST name. There are also Navitimers that has the 6, 9, and 12 subdial layout with the date and branding at the 3 o'clock position. Another specialized Navitimer is the Navitimer spatiograph that has a 10-minute countdown timer for holding patterns and timing descents. Other complications are also seen on the Navitimer, ranging from simple such as the Twin 60 that has 2 60-scale subdials, up to having a moon phase complication or split seconds or retropante. By 2009, the formula for the perfect Navitimer is complete with the Breitling 01, which was produced with Breitling's in-house caliber movement. Navitimers are mostly chronometer-grade timepieces, which is essential for aviation professionals. These watches are generally large, typically starting at 42 millimeters. The watch wears big on the wrist because of that slide rule bezel that is packed with all the details. This is very much evident on the all-white dial Navitimers. Despite the seeming and actual large proportions of the Navitimer, it maintains its allure. In fact, it's part of what makes it appealing. Compared to other unnecessarily huge watches, the Navitimer is large for a reason. Too many reasons, really. Even today, when the Navitimer can be argued as not needed with all the advanced computers, both in the cockpit and the pilot's wrist, the Navitimer continues to be Breitling's best seller. There's a certain elegance that we associate with the Navitimer. It could be that crown-like bezel grips, or maybe that long lug horns. The Navitimer, especially on leather, endures down to our present day. We visualize a respectable pilot with his straightened uniform and a Navitimer strapped onto his wrist. We wish we could be him. We wish at least to have what's on his wrist. It's not just a mess of numbers, lines, and scales. It's a loyal dedication to two industries that Breitling catered to. We dream to be a part of that. It is cool to be a pilot. It's not just a romanticized occupation, it really is cool to fly an aircraft. But ask anyone which is more likely for anyone to attain, a Breitling Navitimer or a pilot's license. A distinguished few can get both. The vast majority can settle for this mess of numbers and lines. That's the why you should buy a Navitimer. If somehow your heart convinced your mind and pocket to own one, what now? How do I use this luxurious piece of aviation instrument? You'll have to tune in for our next installment.